So welcome to this webinar, which is about the blended approach to teaching and learning this evening. My name is Jo Stone and I'm the lead professional for EdTech and an EdTech demonstrator for the DFE EdTech Demonstrator programme. This evening, I'm delighted to be joined by David Briggs, who is the Director of Primary for the Discovery Schools Trust. David has observed blended learning develop and evolve over a number of years in our trust, and he has supported schools to embed this approach. So now he has a deep understanding about how effective blended learning can be when it is applied through careful planning and carefully honing the lessons and integrating it into the curriculum with purposeful intent. So tonight, David will talk about blended learning and the actual approach itself and why it will improve teaching and learning and school systems. He's going to talk about how to embed blended learning across the school in every year group, and to also talk about how school leaders need to change mindsets, and then where to begin, and also how to make it relevant to your school's context. So if you have any questions for David, please add them to the chat bar and we will then answer them after David's presentation this evening. But before David starts to present, I've just got a couple of questions, if that's okay, David. So the first one is, as the Director of Primary in the Discovery Schools Trust, what made you realise that this transformation in schools was going to be necessary?
It's a good question. Good question. And, yeah, nice to join you this evening. And yeah, it's been great to see, particularly coming out of COVID, how our mindsets are changing because of the use of technology during the pandemic and that sort of that drive to have to use technology. So an element of it, I think, was the fact that we sort of a bit of a wake-up call, really, and I talk about this at the start of my presentation, is the fact that I think for a long time we've recognised that we've sort of lagged behind a bit compared to sort of educational sort of structures across the world. So COVID sort of gave us that kickstart, really, that drive to sort of get technology in place, to use it with purpose. But then I think also we were starting to think, well, actually, this could now be utilised more within the classroom. There's some real potential here in terms of reducing teacher workload, inspiring children, you know, enabling them to take ownership of their learning. So I think it's the fact that we've known that it's been there, and now we've sort of had this real drive and this push to really think about the long-term strategy for developing the use of technology within the classroom. I think it's really exciting. So, but hopefully I'll unpick that a little bit more as well as we go through the webinar.
Absolutely. I think some of these questions you'll probably already be covering most of this anyway. So this next one really is just I suppose a little quick insight into your presentation, but I just thought, yeah, what do school leaders need to consider when they do think about their first steps to EdTech? Have you got a sort of a quick answer to that one, really?
I think really it's just understanding your starting points, because I know even though that we try to get consistency and sort of partially sort of align things across the trust, we also understand that every school is very different in terms of its context and also its expertise. So we've found those schools that have, you know, a considerable expertise within their schools perhaps are in a better place to drive forward in terms of putting in place some of the suggestions and the resources and the platforms that we have in use of technology. But I think it's always, you know, going back to that why and really understanding, you know, as an organisation, as a trust at school level, you know, what is it we're trying to achieve? Why are we making these changes? And then having that clear plan and that clear journey that you can sort of, you know, assess yourself against, but also be very clear in terms of the steps that you need to take in order to get to that end goal. But really importantly is knowing what is that end goal, and is it going to impact on the quality of education for the children in the school? I think that's most important thing to consider when you're starting to implement. So I think start with the why, basically, which is what Simon Sinek would always suggest.
Absolutely. Completely agree. I will let you start your presentation, David.
Yeah,
Thank you very much.
So I'll build on some of those points, hopefully, and just share my screen for you. Right. Oh, let me just get this PowerPoint up. It's disappeared. Sorry, just 1 second. Here we go. That's one of the challenges with technology. We've got so much stuff on files and everything now, haven't we? We've got almost too
That's
much
right.
going on. So hopefully you can see that. Can you see all of that?
Yep, all good.
Brilliant. Okay, so I think basically the first slide where I'm going to start off is this understanding that, you know, technology is not replacing teachers or teaching, but we really love this phrase that pedagogy is the driver and technology is the accelerator. And we know that there are many aspects to teaching and learning that can make effective teaching, you know, and first of all, we need to understand as leaders what is effective teaching. You know, what are the elements of good practice that we want to see in the classroom, because it's not just about having technology there, it's having technology to enable those elements of good practice that are rooted in research that enable good learning to happen. So we need to understand that the foundations of good practice, whether it be the elements of Rosenshine's principles of good practice, or it may be around other elements of research and cognitive science, what we want is the technology to really sort of, as the phrase says, accelerate that practice. But I'm really, you know, I'm really passionate about seeing in classrooms creativity and children being inspired and motivated and independent in their learning. So as well as technology being able to develop practice in terms of pedagogy, it can also be a really good vehicle to opening the doors to the children's world, to inspiring and motivating them and to think differently about their learning. I think it's so true that, like I said earlier, the tide has turned and it really is time to adjust the sails and wake up to the fact that, you know, we need technology, we need a curriculum that is enabling children to develop a whole breadth of skills so that they are ready for the world of work that they are going to work in. And, you know, we hear time and time again, don't we, that we don't know what children are going to be doing in years to come, what work they're going to be engaged in. What we do know is, and what we've seen during COVID, is that we have to have children and adults that are able to adapt, that they're able to rise to problems, that they're able to face problems and be critical thinkers. And in order to do that, not only do we need to change the structures within our curriculum, not just the content, but we need to change the way that we teach. You know, far too often we've been in classrooms where, you know, we'd be forgiven to be thinking we were in a time warp, and we'd be going in and, you know, yes, there'd be laptops and an interactive whiteboard, and, you know, and we would be able to say, yes, we're using technology, but still for many years we have seen teachers being up at the front, you know, forward facing, teaching for a majority of the time through the lesson, you know, and some of those structures are still there. You know, when I go back to my old primary school, you know, just in a physical sense, a lot of our primary schools have not changed over time. I think the tide is turning in that fact. And when we're going into schools now, we are seeing that shift in not just the use of technology and the amount of technology that we have in classrooms, but also thinking about the setup of classrooms, thinking about the structures and the way that we group and organise our tables, and the way that we might have one group using the technology, how we might use you know, the actual organisation of children working in groups and pairs and independently, and, you know, seeing children at a laptop with the headphones on. You know, there's a whole change and shift in the way that we're seeing the environment change. I've also seen, and you've seen as well, haven't you, Joe, that the schools are starting to rethink about how they use their IT labs, and not just having an IT suite with standalone computers, but really starting to think about how that can be a multimedia place for children to engage with technology, whether it be in using the VR headsets, whether they're doing 3D printing, or whether they're using you know, the technology for research, but being a place that they can come and go. And I think that's just one example in this sort of change in the way that we're presenting technology and making it accessible for children. But we need the technology to not just be a gimmick. We need it to be a tool that will enable children to engage in problem solving, to enable them to think differently about their learning. And most importantly, what I've seen in schools is children becoming more independent in their learning. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a while. But I want to go back to this fact that you know, pedagogy has to come first. You know, it has to be at the forefront, and we have to pair high quality practice with the innovative ways that technology can bring the classroom to life. And in the Microsoft Infused Classroom, it talks about, you know, the technology being the spice of the recipe, you know, and giving that boom to the lesson. And as I've said, in its simplest form, technology can really open the doors to children's awareness of the wider world. You know, having something interesting on as the children come in, having video clips, having access to live speakers. You know, it's quite costly, isn't it, having trips out to different places, but I've really enjoyed seeing how schools have invited people into the classroom through Teams, through Zoom, and actually talking live to the children. Something exciting that we've been doing with the trust is actually engaging the children with developing relationships with children from across the world. So we've seen children having live meetings with children out in New Delhi, which has been just absolutely fantastic. And for the first time over this last year, we've had our pupil parliament meeting online on a regular basis across all of our 13 schools. So in its simplest form, there's some really missed tricks there in terms of getting children to communicate, getting children to broaden their horizons, and particularly those children that perhaps don't step a foot outside of their own estate or out of their own city or their county, and getting them to explore through the use of platforms such as Lifter. Being able to explore the wider world is absolutely fantastic. But what we want is teachers to hold on to the good practice, the practice that they know is in their tool bag that they need in order to have effective outcomes. Now, we know that, you know, one of those most important aspects of teaching and learning is relationships, and teachers need good relationships with their children in order to have those foundations for good learning. And technology, again, is a good tool to develop those relationships, whether it be through communication, but also that understanding that children sort of need technology, that they sort of expect technology. You know, we've seen technology, haven't we, be quite removed from the classroom, yet when children go home and in their own social lives, they use technology all of the time, but the actual percentage of time that we use technology in the classroom is minimal to that compared to their own time outside of the school day. That's not to say that we want to see, you know, schools using technology for 100% of the school day, and I think there's a balance to be had in terms of how much time children are using on screen and using books, and that balance between the written form and also text used on the computer. So, you know, it is about that balance, but there's also that recognition that we have got to embrace technology. It's not going away. It's going to be there for the future of these children, and they are going to need it to access the careers that they will be choosing and their higher education when they move forward. It's also important, I think, as leaders to recognise that in primary schools we need to be working more closely with our secondary schools, so that whatever we're putting in place in the primary, hopefully that will follow on into secondary as well. And I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done within that area as well. The quote from the Education Endowment Foundation in their report in terms of implementing technology suggested that technology has the potential to improve teaching and learning in a wide variety of ways, but potential is the pivotal word. Alongside examples where technology has enhanced learning are many others where technology has fallen short. Understanding how technology's potential can be realised is a key question for teachers and school leaders today. So again, it's going back to that why, but also when we're seeing technology in the classroom, is it having the impact on outcomes for pupils? You know, is it improving learning? And most importantly, is it making learning inclusive for children within the classroom? And technology can be a great tool for enabling learning to be more inclusive for individuals. But we need to be sure that we're not mistaken about what blended learning looks like and what it actually is in the classrooms. And I think as leaders, we need to establish that within ourselves first before we start our expectations on what we're seeing within the classrooms for our teachers. So lots of CPD is needed before we start implementing change within the classrooms. As I've said, there are many different learning strategies based on cognitive science and research that our teachers are very much aware of or should be aware of. But if we are going to use technology to develop such examples as space practice and retrieval, we have, you know, using concrete examples, and technology can be a great resource for doing that. Interleaving and how do we sort of weave subjects together. elaboration, and how do we use our teaching to make sure that children have the opportunity to elaborate on their understanding and deepen that understanding. And then finally, dual coding as well is one of the key areas of pedagogy rooted in cognitive science. We need to make sure that we are investing time out for our teachers to not only learn these effective strategies for teaching and learning, but also to start to develop ways that technology can enhance these principles of good practice. And as leaders, again, you know, if we're expecting more of our teachers, and by golly, did we expect more of them during the pandemic, you know, we need to be making sure that we have the systems in place to provide that dedicated space for teachers to learn, because we know that, you know, teaching is a complex thing, isn't it? You know, it's like, you know, brain surgeons, teachers are brain developers, and there's always something new to learn. And on a daily basis, teachers are having to adapt their practice, change their practice according to the pupils that are in front of them. We also have the challenge of meeting national expectations, you know, and coming out of the pandemic, we have huge gaps within learning, particularly with our disadvantaged pupils. And it's how do we strike that balance of expecting new innovative ways of teaching, whilst also ensuring that we have the rigour and the consistency to enable children to meet the gaps within their learning. So a good place, I think, for leaders to start would be to look at the Education Endowments Foundation, their report on the effective implementation of technology. And it's a good place to sort of start in terms of thinking about your own implementation and what that might look like. And in its recommendation in number 1, I think is really significant, is the fact that new technology can often appear exciting. However, it can become a solution in the search of problem. However, it can become a solution in the search of a problem unless it is introduced in response to an identified need. So we need to think, well, why do we need the technology? What is it going to do to enhance and improve outcomes? It is often useful to link the introduction of new technology to wider planning, for example, a review of the assessment policy. So perhaps if we're looking at ways to engage children in feedback, to think about how that we as teachers can feedback to our pupils, it may be that technology or a tool or a platform that we've seen may be useful to help with that driver that we've identified. Schools need to consider the pedagogical rationale for how technology will improve learning, which I've just been talking about now, and the principles of how to use technology successfully are not distinct from questions of how to teach effectively or how children learn. So we mustn't see them as two separate elements. And within Discovery, we have a very clear teaching and learning strategy. And what we've done is we didn't want to replace that with a strategy of how to teach using technology. We've blended the two. So we've looked at, you know, in terms of developing the environment for learning, how can technology sort of enhance those standards that we're trying to meet. If we're looking at effective feedback, how can we use technology to support effective feedback in the classroom? If we're looking at inclusion and ensuring that children can access their learning, how can we use tools like Immersive Reader to ensure that children can engage in the learning? Perhaps it's even as simple as having the lesson structured within OneNote so that they can follow the lesson independently and go at their own pace. So what I'm suggesting is that don't do away with all of the good practice that you know exists within your school. Supplement it with technology, and if it works and it's proven to work, give it a go. But if it doesn't, be brave enough to actually think, right, well, no, this isn't working, we need to change. Without a clear plan for support and implementation, technology is much less likely to have an impact. This includes considering what initial training will be needed, what time and resources are required, and what ongoing support should be available. And there's absolute wealth of information and CPD out there, isn't there, on the MEC and all of those resources that our teachers can access. But unless they have the time and they have the support and the direction, that can be easily lost. So what might be an idea is to have for each of your year groups a sort of progression or a mapped out journey of what you hope to achieve within the academic year for that year group, because one size doesn't fit all, and it would be a waste of time for some teachers to be sat in staff meetings where the tools and the technology that we're trying to implement are not relevant for that year group. So I think it needs to be tailored to the individual year group and the individual in terms of what their needs are. Decisions about whether to introduce technology should also include an analysis of the costs of implementing the technology, but most importantly, alongside the expected benefits, thinking about not only the upfront costs, but also any ongoing requirements. And I think schools are finding that a challenge. During lockdown, we got all of this funding, got given all of these great laptops, but it's how do we sustain that? What plan do we have in place to replace that equipment? Because wouldn't it be awful if we had really good systems in place, really good resources, and then we were unable to sustain that going forward? And some of that is unclear because budgets can change. But I think it's really important to make note of that. Subscriptions to platforms, if we can't sustain those and then we've used them and they've been highly effective, it would be really disappointing to have to take them away. So I think thinking strategically as leaders, as head teachers, as SLT, we really need to think about this of working together and really thinking about the relationship. If we're working in a trust, what is the relationship and the conversation and the communication between the school, the teacher and the pupils? Now, leaders' mindsets have to be sort of aligned in some respect, and this has been interesting, and I found this is that over time, particularly during the pandemic, leaders' mindsets have changed. At the beginning of the pandemic, I remember talking about and our CEO talking to us about the fact that we need to get everybody trained up on Teams and we need to get everybody really confident with using Teams. And we thought, well, that's never going to happen. We don't need that. And look at what did happen. And very quickly, our mindsets did change and we started to think very differently about how we were going to access learning for our pupils. So yes, we've had to wake up to the response of COVID, but we also need to think deeply about what is our ethos, what is our vision for the use of technology in our classrooms. So leadership is key, and thinking strategically about why and how to implement technology in all aspects of our work needs to be at the forefront. So I've put here this slide and I put a few models of this together in terms of how you might sort of approach this idea of working together and really getting that clear understanding. So first of all, it may be that we look at the pupil. So it might be, do we start with the pupil and work outwards? So if we're looking at the pupil, what do the pupils need? What are we finding across our group of schools or across our school in terms of outcomes? Are there particular areas that we're finding children lack? Are we finding that they lack expertise in problem solving or collaboration or pupil voice? Are we finding that there are specifics around the curriculum that we would like to improve, and how would the use of technology improve outcomes? So I've used, an example at the beginning of this session about the fact that some of our schools, children's experiences are limited. Their awareness of the wider world and their understanding of the world, different religions, different faiths, different cultures, different backgrounds is very limited. Their aspirations might be very low. So how that might be a key driver for the use of technology. And although it might be very small, that can then escalate to wider aspects of the use of technology. So that might be a starting point, and that's just one example. But then going from that, if that's what we've identified, what then does the teacher need? How would the use of technology improve their practice? So what tools are they going to need in the classroom? What are we going to need to change? What would we need to put in place in terms of their own CPD? And how are we going to get our teachers on board? Are we communicating with our teachers? Are we actually engaging with them so that they can share their thoughts and their understanding of how they might see technology being used within the classroom? Because we know that the worst model is to have that done to model and that expectation that you must or you will. We want that buy-in to this, and we want that long-term sustainability. And in order to do that, we need to get the buy-in from our teachers, because they're the ones day in, day out who are going to have to be using this technology and using the things that we're expecting or wanting to see within the classroom. And then at a trust level, it's then thinking about, well, what do the schools need in order to implement that? So do we need to come together collectively to be more cost effective in terms of our resources? Do we need to think about what systems we might put in place as a trust to support schools to provide CPD? And that's where we can really reduce, the impact. Not reduce what am I trying to say? We're trying to reduce the amount, the duplication of CPD. So really sort of that collaboration and using the expertise across the school. And how do we share good practice? How do we come together to evaluate what we've decided to put in place? And then as a trust, how can we harness technology to be more effective? How can we use it to perhaps communicate more, how we can use it to reduce teacher and leaders' workload. So not just thinking about at the school level and the pupil level, but actually as a trust, how can we think about the use of technology to support adults within our organisation? And I don't know about you, but we've carried on many aspects of the work that we did during the pandemic. Coming out of the pandemic, we've carried that on. So having network meetings virtually, we've got groups of schools that work quite wide apart, across Leicester and Leicestershire. And traditionally we would come together face to face. Well, we've carried on with those meetings virtually. For the first time this year, we've had moderation virtually, and that's been highly successful. And a lot of people were doubtful of that, but once we gave it a go, we quickly realised that actually it was very effective. But most importantly, I think there's a really, the opportunity for schools, for teachers, for pupils to actually share their learning and share their work across schools, across the organisation using technology could be really powerful. A similar model here, is starting with the why. At the top here, really establishing and thinking what our long-term vision is. What are we trying to achieve, and who are we doing this for? And hopefully at the forefront of that will be our pupils. How are we going to change mindsets? What are our mindsets like? Who have we got? Whenever you start a project of change, it's sort of looking at the mindsets of individuals and tapping into those that we think have got the potential to help and support that change. But then really having a plan and having that well documented and thought out in terms of its implementation, and then communicating that. How are we going to communicate that to all of our different individuals, schools across the trust? And then in the middle here of the sandwich, I suppose, is really thinking about the infrastructure and the technical support that might be needed, and what procurement might be needed to be established in order for that to happen. And we found, and I don't know whether you found, but in the early days, was that many of our schools didn't have the infrastructure in terms of just the Wi-Fi or the internet access to be able to cope with the amount of equipment that we were starting to see increase within our schools. But infrastructure as well in terms of the physical environment and things like having the right chargers for the computers and the cabinets and the storage for all of the equipment. And if we were sending netbooks home, what would that look like in terms of children being able to carry the equipment? So in a very simplistic level, what do we need to consider in terms of all of those the infrastructure with our schools? And then, as I've said before, thinking about that CPD, the time to learn, the environment changes that might need to happen. And then what we're starting to look at now in a much broader sense is the curriculum design, and thinking about now, have we revisited the curriculum planning? Have we looked at the schemes of learning? And have we now that we're saying that we want one of our drivers, not the only driver to be technology, but one of the drivers, one of the foundations of our curriculum to be, our children to be technologically capable, then what does our curriculum look like, and what does the planning look like? And that's a whole new set of work that we're embarking on now, is going back to our schemes of learning and looking at how technology can support the design of that. So if we're looking at perhaps the children, are investigating deforestation, how are we using technology, and how are we using technology to enable children to get those outcomes and to make those outcomes more real and relevant to the children and have choice in that. Okay, so not too many more slides. Am I okay for time, Jo?
Yes, absolutely fine. You've got, let's see, another 20 minutes if you want it, 15.
Okay. Yep, fine. I can carry on. Okay. So this slide is useful just to, and there's a lot more information around this in terms of, if you Google blended learning, there's lots of definitions and lots of webinars and talks about what is blended learning and what it isn't. And I think we've come on a journey with this really, and I know myself, going into schools, I've seen lots of perhaps lots of versions of blended learning, lots of opinions about what people think blended learning is, and I think it's really important to establish and get that right. And in my opinion, and it may not be right, and I hope Joe agrees with me, is that it is not just having the netbooks out in the classroom. It's more about the engagement of the children. And I think it's more about the children taking that ownership of their learning. And it talks here about some element of student control is critical. And it would be very easy to have computers out in the classroom, for the teacher to be using technology and it to look like it's a technology rich environment, but actually the children have very little control over it. The teacher is still in control. And this for me is the most significant part. And this is what I've come to realise, and is what I'm looking for when I'm going into the classroom, is the children being able, in some elements of the lesson, to take that control over their learning and the direction of their learning. It might be around the outcome of their learning. But most importantly, for some children, I think there's a real potential here for children to follow a lesson in a different way than they may traditionally have. So take, for example, during lockdown, a lot of our lessons were recorded and delivered to our children. And that meant that those lessons could be taught or watched at any time during the day. It also meant that the children were able to control the pace of their learning. They had the ability to pause, to go back or to skip forward through the content as free agents, as it says here. And I think that is so important for inclusion, but so important for some of the elements of cognitive science and learning, and this idea of being able to retrieve learning and to be able to embed learning so that it becomes part of our long-term memory. So I think that's a really interesting element to explore. But also, I think there's the opportunity for children to be able to choose various platforms to present their learning. And, you know, I've seen in classrooms where children who are very confident, perhaps with using OneNote, are now really enjoying displaying and sharing their learning in different forms, you know, whether that be through text, whether it be through them recording their learning, whether it be through them providing examples of things that they've found online through research. And I think in terms of teachers, reducing workload and not having to replicate and photocopy worksheets, but being able to send out, you know, the lesson to pupils rather than having to print out resources, sticking them in books. You know, there's some real sort of quick wins there. You know, as I said, we wouldn't want to see that disappear completely. It's the balance between the two. So yes, technology can be used for instruction, for demonstration, but most importantly, we want children to take a little bit of ownership over it, to use the tools, to have a go, and also not be sort of afraid of making mistakes. And hopefully that's what we're starting to see in some of our schools now. And I'm just going to share with you this video. I'll probably show you just part of it, but hopefully if you've got access to this PowerPoint afterwards, you'll be able to watch the majority of this video clip.
I think it's just because obviously it's a daily thing. We use laptops in daily life, and I think we're going to be using applications a lot more in the future. There's things going everywhere at the moment with applications, so it's only going to improve their knowledge.
So if they can't type, they might be able to send a CV in terms of work. The quicker we get them into that, the quicker they can use it at secondary school, they can move on to college or university or whatever they need to. But it's the way the world's going. There's not many handwritten stuff anymore, and there's not many things you do without technology. You've always got a phone at your hand. Why not teach them to actually use it properly?
It's 50-50 now in the world that we are leading, and the generation that our children, as they get older, and how technology is going to be so important in their everyday life, just as it is for us now.
Well, because they're going to be going into the workplace, and that's what they're going to use. They're going to use laptops every day, they're going to use computers every day, so it's important that they get a head start now in knowing what they need to do for the future, because that's what they're going to use when they're going to secondary school, university, college, and into the workplace as well.
So teachers' confidence now is extremely high. Teachers aren't afraid to have a go. So when we suggest something, or whether they, when they experience something on the MEC, or when there's been an update, for instance, in OneNote or within Teams, which they have to adapt to, they're not afraid of doing that because they know it works. We made it a prerequisite for us to say that we wanted Joe to come in every 3 weeks. 2:30 to 3:30 working with support staff, and then 3:30 till 5 with our teachers. And the teachers and support staff would set the agenda for those. What are you struggling on? What else do you want to look at? Let's look at the MEC together. Having that support network there is absolutely integral, because if you can build that confidence within your staff, then the staff won't be afraid to use it within the classroom and introduce it to their teachers. And I think it's schools that I look at now that perhaps aren't as far ahead of us haven't made that the priority of using that training that's out there to do that.
It has. It's been really, really useful. Obviously, we know that we've got Joe to go to if we ever need support. You ain't like straight away. You're always there, so it's great to know that you are on hand with that. But in terms of going through the things that we've been doing at school, the whole having computers for themselves, and they just get on. They just want to show what they're made of. At the moment, they're writing historical narratives, and they say, "Can we type them?" And they've been typing them up and showing all that additional creativity and what they can do on a laptop, but also showcasing it into their everyday lessons. It's been really exciting.
If we hadn't had the continued professional development sessions with Joe, we wouldn't be aware of a lot of these apps and how to effectively use the Microsoft suite. There is no way I'd have known all of those ways that we could use it. I'd have probably stuck to using Word within Teams, and maybe if I'd felt a little bit brave, using Notebook.
We've transferred all our maths teaching in Key Stage 2 onto OneNote now. And the feedback that we've got from staff is that that's reduced their workload in terms of providing paper resources. We've got rid of all those worksheets. We use White Rose Maths, and the White Rose materials are very transferable from the White Rose platform into OneNote. So again, our children can bring that up very, very easily. Our children annotate and digitally ink, onto OneNote, in terms of their very clear thinking and structure. And then our teachers feedback very quickly on that as well. So it can be very immediate, and I know that's reduced workload quite considerably.
To be honest, I think the whole idea of bringing in blended learning schools, like giving the children more independence with things, when we can set them a task and they can go off to the computer and do it themselves to research different people, the children become more independent. They feel like they become more inquisitive. They see one thing on the computer and they go off and find, I want to find out more about that. So I think it's helped them massively in terms of deepening their understanding of what they want to search for, really.
I feel like they can recall their learning a lot better because of all the quizzes that they're doing. They're learning and they don't realise they're learning because they're playing the quizzes. They're really competitive. They want to win, and they're recalling facts that they might not realise they're doing. And I think they're a lot more technologically advanced than they were last year as well. They're a lot faster at typing, a lot faster at using the apps, and I think it's really helping their learning in that way as well.
I feel like technology has lessened my workload in lots of ways. So there's no printing, there's no making sure that you've got things differentiated and printed out and trimmed and ready for lessons. It's much easier to just send out.
It's made workload a little bit easier because planning is and marking is mostly on OneNote, which is a dream because we're not lugging loads of books home at the end of the day, and it gives you that freedom to think a little bit outside the box with planning as well. So it's not just the same thing each time, it's a little bit different. And yeah, it's a bit fun, it's a bit creative, which I like, is what's my favourite part of this career, so it allows you to be a bit creative and fun.
I find marking amazing on it. It takes me 5 minutes to mark. You don't have to flip to the same page every single time in a different book. Using OneNote, I find it so easy just to review every child's work, next one. In terms of that, it makes it so much easier. It saves on printing, having to queue up for the printer in the morning, because we've got all the work there on the computer ready for them to access when they need it.
It has had an impact on workload because obviously it's there all in one place. So at the end of the day, when you come to marking their lessons, it's all in one place and you can filter through and review each child's work. So in that terms, it's not lugging 32 books home every day. It's there on my laptop. The children like it because it can be instant feedback. So sometimes whilst they've been working, I've had their OneNote open, especially during lockdown when we were working from home. I was then speaking to them whilst we're on a live Teams call, saying, actually, have a look at your third sentence and edit it. And we was kind of doing it like together, so cooperating and collaboratively. It was really nice in that terms. But yeah, definitely had a big impact on workload because you're not having to print off 32 sheets and cutting them. It's all there for them. Obviously using forms as well to quiz them on. It's just a different way of learning now.
With the apps like Kahoot and Sentry, you get the data already done for you. So, for example, they've just completed a diagnostic for space. I can go in and I can have a look at how well they know, what they already know, and that's going to inform my planning to know, okay, they already know this, I can move on, I can challenge them further, and it also allows me to see who might need that little bit of extra support as well. So it's really helpful in being able to kind of spot the people who need a bit of challenge and spot the people who need a bit of support as well.
So I hope you found that interesting, just seeing some examples from some of our schools within Discovery, and it's great to see teachers talking about the impact on learning within the classroom. I think it's so important that, as I've said before, if we want this to work, if we want this change to happen, then we do need to think about not only what good teaching consists of, but also spending enough time helping teachers understand what that looks like, and also being able to share their practice. But most importantly, as I said earlier, we need to invest time in their own learning. Time for teachers to be able to research, to be able to identify what it is that they want to develop, but most importantly, time to try it out and be able to reflect on that and to develop it and to improve. So we really need to make sure that as a trust and as leaders, what systems are we putting in place for our staff, because we are expecting more from them, you know, and outcomes will only improve if we focus more on improving pedagogy through quality first teaching, which can be enhanced through the use of technology. And we mustn't forget our support staff too. You know, we're expecting more of our support staff in helping within the classrooms and supporting our teachers, and they need upskilling as well. This year, we did put in place a new initiative to enable that time to happen for learning, which is what we call in Discovery teacher development time. We're hugely proud of it, and we're very much in the early days of teacher development time within the Trust. And if any of you are interested in finding out more about this, then please do get in touch with ourselves. But basically, we are providing additional time for teachers on top of their PPA to have teacher development time, not only for our early career framework teachers, but also for teachers right through the school, so that they can have a weekly time, a weekly session to receive instructional coaching by a qualified coach. And in that time, the opportunity to identify different areas of practice that they need to develop or want to upskill themselves in. That can be around the use of technology, but also in all the other elements of good practice in terms of teaching and learning. Interestingly, one of the ways that we've achieved this is to provide recorded virtual lessons for art and computing across our trust. And not all of our schools, but the majority of our schools now have weekly virtual lessons being taught by a specialist in art and computing. And I can't tell you how fantastic it's been to see the outcomes produced from these lessons. And we really are also showing a sort of increase in enthusiasm and interest within these subjects because of the regularity and also the expertise that is being shared through the teaching of these subjects. And it's just another good way of using technology to enable structures to happen within schools and provide support so that teachers can be released, but also how we can use computing, use technology to share teachers' expertise across a number of settings. So that I just wanted to flag up that there are ways to think out of the box and think differently in terms of how we can put support in place to enable learning for teachers to happen. But if you'd like to know more about that, then please do get in touch. This is just an overview of how that works for each of our year groups, and the fact that each of our year groups gets provided with now on a weekly basis a recorded lesson for art and a recorded lesson for computing. And what happens is that the support staff facilitate those lessons that are led by those lead professionals. The feedback's been absolutely fantastic, and you can read here that our teachers, 100% of our teachers now have this time in our trust and also have a coach that we've trained up to work with them on their own learning path. But I loved some of these comments here, but what was great was when they came together for moderation and they were looking at writing, the teachers were able to identify a number of different research projects that they'd been looking at during their teacher development time that they were able to share with colleagues, which is really significant. But also, as Emma mentions here from Moacre, the fact that they have that consistency now and that it just doesn't sort of happen in the first term, but this has been going on now, and on a weekly basis they have that regular contact with their coaches, which is fantastic to hear. So I think just to finish, there are exciting times ahead, and there's many opportunities. There's a whole, array of resources, strategies, processes, systems that we can develop and improve through the use of technology. But I think most importantly, it's this idea of putting the world back in the children's hands and giving those children more ownership over their learning, and more opportunities to collaborate with one another, but also to open the doors of the classroom to the wider world, which I think technology has the power to do. So it's very exciting. There are challenges ahead. There's always going to be challenges, and with technology there comes cost. And I think as leaders we need to bear that in mind, and we need to think of ways that we can be more innovative and more forward thinking about how we can overcome those barriers. But I think, as I've said, the most important thing is that it's all of our children's rights to have an education which will enable them to succeed when they go on to high school, but most importantly for them to be able to access those skills in order to be productive and be able to access the working world that they will be within. So I'm going to end on that slide and return back to yourselves.
That was great, David. Thank you. And you covered so much there. It was unbelievable how much content is in that. But I really like the fact you brought it right back to the fact that it's about the 21st century learning skills for the children. It's about that whole approach to teaching and learning, isn't it? And the fact is, at the end of the day, the tech is the tool to enhance, and it's not the key thing in that lesson. So I really like the way you emphasise that part, because it is one of the biggest messages, isn't it, that's come out of this, I think.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
And support they need, which is what you've been providing. It was great to hear the support. You were mentioned there in the video that they really appreciate that CPD, which is so important. Without that, we don't have that long-term sustainability, do we? I
think that's it. And and I think whoever does that role, like as you say, it's about I suppose it's the glue, isn't it, that keeps it together and keeps us on the journey, keeps us on that path, thinking about it. Yeah. But I was just going to say, for you personally, I just wondered what the key benefits were really that you've sort of seen out of this. Which ones would you sort of highlight that have come out of blended learning that you've seen recently that you would say these are, you know, maybe your top three?
I think this idea of inclusion is at the top there. I think it's been great to see children access learning in different ways. It's not always appropriate for all children, but I think children are so adept to using technology, aren't they? They're so confident at home, you know, just their ability to text. And sometimes we see that as a negative. And as adults in our generation, we tend to be critical of children in terms of, oh, they spend all of this time on social media, they're always texting. But we have to recognise that that's their way of life. That's their sort of passage now, isn't it? And we've almost been giving them an injustice in terms of not embracing that within the classroom. So I think that sort of really sort of seeing the children be inspired and motivated, and some of the children have been teaching us, haven't they? When you go in the classroom and they're able to demonstrate and share to us how they're doing their learning and bringing their learning in from home. So that is absolutely fantastic. But one of the most rewarding things I think seeing now is children talking to each other across settings, and I know we can do that more, but the group conversations that I've been involved in with the children in Delhi, you know, and seeing children from two very contrasting cultures, settings, talking about their differences, but most importantly, talking about their similarities, and without technology, we would never be able to do that. And so the power that has is just absolutely fantastic. And then I think thirdly is some of our, I hate to say it, and I might get shot down for this, some of our younger teachers coming into the trust, being able to embrace, you know, technology, be able to use the technology that they know, that they've been taught, that they are familiar with, and being able to think differently about learning and have a voice with that and have a go, you know, being able to experiment and not be afraid of, you know, perhaps not working, or when it does work, being able to share that across our schools and seeing, you know, that their kudos sort of like increase, you know, it's just been great for them to share practice at such an early stage in their career. But also how quickly some of our more experienced teachers have taken on board this technology, and the great job that they have done as well, I think, has been fantastic. So yeah, I could go on and on. There's loads of positives, isn't there, that we're seeing?
It's good to hear. I just wondered if, now this is a bit of a tricky question really, but I was just thinking, in terms of the transformation you've seen so far, what might you predict might you see in the next 5 years? You know, moving forward.
Crikey, yes, that's I guess I could say what I would like to see, and I would like to, I could give a suggestion of what I wouldn't like to see. I wouldn't like to see teachers and the human being replaced within the classroom. I don't think that's going to happen. I think that human emotion and that relationship with the pupil and the teacher, you know, has to be there. And I think I also am a bit of a traditionalist in terms of the fact that I do like to see children being able to write and to have those key skills, to be literate, to be able to read, write and do their maths. And yes, we will be seeing technology more and more being used to demonstrate that understanding. You know, and I wouldn't like to see, you know, the written form disappear completely, but we have to acknowledge that the majority of the time children do write using, you know, technology. And I think workload, you know, teacher workload, I think this technology is going to have massive impact on in terms of, you know, what we're doing there, and you know, we've got a long way to go in that, I think, you know, and I particularly think around if we're going down the route of more trusts, you know, more schools working collaboratively together. You know, traditionally we have seen schools producing documents, you know, over and over, you know, and multiple copies of things. And I think now we're seeing the opportunity to share, you know, and to reduce the workload that's involved in all of that. So planning and lesson planning, delivery of lessons, covering lessons, you know, and I think there's great potential there for the use of technology. So, you know, I think who knows where we're going to go. I mean, it's incredible, isn't it? But you know, over this short space of time, but there's some elements I would really want to keep hold of as well.
Yeah, I agree. There's some traditional skills that you just absolutely need. Yeah, they're still crucial at the core and the heart of it, aren't they?
Like talking. But then again, when you think, like, you know, how much talking and speaking and listening can be developed through children being engaged in webinars and presentations online and, you know, group calls. So it's and they're a bit more confident to do that, aren't they, on this platform rather than standing up in front of the classroom. So, you know, it'd be interesting to see if that improves our children's ability to articulate themselves.
Absolutely, the oracy skills will be very interesting. Yes, I agree. And I think that's something that will really develop moving forward as well. That element of it. But yes, like you say, it's just vast, isn't it? But thank you so much, Dave, for your time this evening, and thank you for presenting. It's brilliant. And I was just going to say, if anyone has missed any of the previous webinars, please go onto the Discovery Schools Trust website or the EdTech Demonstrator website. You will be able to catch up with any of the webinars you might have missed, and this one will obviously be on there by tomorrow as well. So please feel free to rewatch those webinars, but please enjoy the rest of the evening, and hopefully we will see you for the final webinar this week on Thursday, which is about pastoral care using tech. So we look forward to seeing you then, but thank you very much for your time.